This is LaRouchePAC Saturday evening class. Tonight's the second of a two-part series by Susan Kokinda on Plato looks at the U.S. 2024 presidential candidates, non-Trump presidential candidates. And as Susan described last week, Plato was living through the collapse of Athens and Athenian society. And he had an acute sense of the weaknesses in the Athenian people and in those who stood up to be their leaders, and had a personal knowledge and personal acquaintance with many of these men. So she began leading us through that problem last week, and we're going to continue tonight. So with that, let me give it to Susan.
All right. Thank you, Tony. Yes, we're going to continue a discussion of the, frankly, very uncanny parallels between ancient Athens and its sister Greek city-states in the 5th century BC, and where we find ourselves as a republic today. The theme of these two classes really is, what is the quality of thinking which will ensure that we promote the general welfare for ourselves and our posterity. Now, posterity, of course, means that you're thinking about the future. It means that you have to have some foundation for knowing that your policies will have the effect that you desire, presuming you want them to be a good effect. I mean, it is the case that we have a force in the world today, an imperial force, which wants to impose ill effects on nations. But take those who, by intention, actually want their nations to prosper and to continue. This is really the subject of Plato's dialogues. Last week, we looked at the Alcibiades dialogue, which is named after the principal character in dialogue with Socrates. He's a young man about to embark on a political and military career without really having that kind of foundation of knowing where your ideas come from. Why do you think what you think? We see Alcibiades actually in subsequent dialogues, and we see his ultimate end in the tragedy which unfolds in Athens, and we see that it actually didn't stick. Socrates' attempt to engage him in this kind of spiritual exercise to be qualified to successfully, not just lead, but to successfully lead his city-state, his civilization. This week, we're going to look at two other figures who similarly end up in ruling positions in Athens, again, many decades after this dialogue takes place. And they too meet a similarly tragic fate. Now, this all happens against the backdrop of what we discussed last week, and which I'll briefly summarize in a few minutes, which is the tragedy of Athens. That is a civilization which in the earlier part of the 5th century, and even before, under great figures like Solon the lawgiver, who was more than a century earlier, somebody Tony has spoken of recently in a very important context. But if you look at the demise of Athens from this high point to the period of time which Plato is, to both Socrates' life which is the period of time that Plato writes about, which is the latter half of the 5th century. And remember, BC. Remember, we're in BC, so things go backward. We're largely talking about a period between 450 BC and approximately 400 BC. Again, these dialogues take place against the backdrop of the tragedy of Athens. Now, I want to put it again in current terms, because if you eliminated the person of Donald Trump from today's political landscape, you would see a similar tragedy unfolding in the United States of America. Without Trump being in the race, it wouldn't matter whether you were talking about the Democratic side or the Republican side. I mean, even with a few of the more nominally courageous people like RFK Jr. or maybe Vivek Ramaswamy, they couldn't function in a world which hadn't been created by Donald Trump's presidency, by his courage, and obviously by his continuing fight. The rest of these candidates, again, with these possible other few exceptions, are completely run by the uniparty, which is, in a sense, the political appendage of the empire. All of these other candidates who are vying for the presidency, and for that matter, almost every other office that we'll be looking at in 2024, they are all managed by a raft of pollsters and consultants, and those people are the artifacts of the opinion machine of the prevailing elite. And the role of that opinion machine is to create the issues, craft the positions, in many cases, often on both sides, and keep the population firmly in a world which is under the control of the elites. That is, you're never allowed in the elites world, and in the world of most of these candidates, you are never allowed to challenge the underlying assumptions. Nowhere are you going to find DeSanctimonious or a Mike Pence or a Nikki Haley challenging the underlying assumptions of today's Anglo-American elite. Those assumptions Donald Trump did challenge, and that's why he did win in 2016. He challenged the perpetual wars, which purpose are fundamentally to constantly keep us at the throats of the other major sovereign nations of the world so that we can never ally against the empire, in particular, Russia and China, in its earlier incarnation, the Soviet Union. These are the enemy images which are supposed to obscure the fact that, as many people I think have now discovered, there's somebody else out there. You can put the name World Economic Forum or globalists on it, but it's the empire. And it's largely a British Empire-based system that you're not really allowed to challenge. You're not allowed to challenge their underlying economic assumptions of free trade or central banking systems or the green ideology. The purpose of the campaign consultants and the people who run them is to make sure that your mind stays inside their system. One of the methods to do this is something which Plato explored throughout his dialogues, which is the evil of sophistry. The idea that you don't look at underlying principles, or frankly, more malignantly, there are no underlying principles. And it's just a question of how you manipulate the ideas, the words, the emotions to ultimately accomplish what you want to accomplish. And obviously, we've seen that today metastasize in the form of big tech's social media algorithms, where you're being profiled every time you hit some kind of clickbait on social media to try and shape your thinking. And I think a lot of people are somewhat conscious of the fact that, part of the enemy's operations, and again, this is what I would call sophistry metastasized, is to simply keep you enraged, over an issue which may have some underlying moral importance, but your only response to it is rage or anger at what is happening, rather than any quality whatsoever of figuring out why it happened. And more importantly, what are you going to do to actually stop it? Obviously, mainstream media censorship is another aspect of this. They don't want you looking at the transformative decisions that have gotten us to where we are gotten. That is there a generating principle that defines the domain within which we are making decisions or not making decisions and merely reacting? Now, Plato's dialogues really are a mental exercise in discovering a method by which you look for those underlying principles, those generative actions which shape everything. And from that standpoint, I want to revisit what I discussed briefly in the first class, which really is the domain within which all of this happens. And that is the fact that in 450 BC, the Athenians decided to stop fighting the Persian Empire, which was the major imperial force of the period. Prior to 450 BC, the Athenians were allied with the other Greek city-states, including Sparta, and had carried out victories against the mighty Persian Empire, which dominated most of what you would call the civilized world. But in 450 BC, a peace is signed, the Peace of Callias, it's sometimes called, in which the Athenians decided to stop fighting the Persians, basically signed a truce with the Persians. Also decided to seize the funds of the other Greek city-states. They all had their funds in a treasury in Delos, and use them essentially to begin to build the Athenian Empire. This, of course, upset many of the other city-states. There was skirmishing and fighting going on after the Peace of Callias, which ultimately broke out in the Peloponnesian War in 432, where you have the Greek city-states, especially with Athens on one side and Sparta on the other, fighting each other instead of what they had been doing decades earlier, which is uniting to fight the empire. Now, think about this from the standpoint of the history of our last 70, 75 years. At the end of World War II, Franklin Roosevelt had a vision. He was not able to carry it out because he died before the end of World War II. But his idea was that that war was not fought to reestablish imperial policies, in particular British imperial policies. But you also had the Dutch, you had the French, and he was very clear in his discussions with Winston Churchill. Winston, we did not fight this war to reestablish British 18th century methods. He intended to work with the other sovereign nations of the world who were not thinking like empires, which was the Soviets. They were a dictatorship, but they weren't thinking like an empire, and China, which of course did not become communist for several years later. But primarily, Roosevelt's intention was to try and liberate the developing sector nations, and this included everything from African countries, to Vietnam, which was under the French Empire, to liberate them and ensure that colonialism and imperialism ended in the world. What happened instead? Winston Churchill, the representative of the British Empire, came to Fulton, Missouri, I believe it was 1946, and basically said, no, the enemy is, gave his famous Iron Curtain speech, the enemy is communism, the Soviets, and succeeded in ensuring that Roosevelt's vision never took place, and that what we've seen for the last 75 years, just like in ancient Greece, is nations who should be allied with each other, or at least at peace with each other, fighting each other, so that the empire, today we call it the globalists, but again, let's give it its brand name. It is the British Empire, such that the empire can continue to actually rule. And what happened? What happened is that Americans capitulated to an opinion created by the empire. We had just fought shoulder to shoulder with the Soviet soldiers. And of course, as people know, the Soviet Union suffered losses, unbelievable losses, stopping Hitler's advance and giving the rest of the world really the time to get its act together and ultimately prevail in World War II. That was all gone. Once the opinion machine was turned on, people capitulated. It was, of course, enforced by McCarthyism, and we saw a good example of how that works with RFK Jr. being battered by the Democrats in Congress last week, who frankly, gave Joe McCarthy a run for his money in terms of their conduct and their attitude. But over these past 70 years, too many people have capitulated to this public opinion machine. Trump has broken that spell, but we have to do more than break the spell. Now, let's go back to ancient Greece, because there was a version of big tech, I guess you could call it, back then. And that was the Oracle of Delphi. As in many ancient cultures, the priest class often had a significant role in shaping opinion, controlling, more often than not, on behalf of an empire, directing societies. Occasionally, you had a scientific priest class, which you actually had in ancient Greece. You really had astronomer priests in ancient Egypt. You had astronomer priests in Egypt, and that scientific tradition had a lot to do, ultimately, with what became classical Greek society. But more often than not, the priest class was an arm of the empire. And what did you have with the Delphic Oracle? You would come, you would pay tribute so that you could get a prophecy. Now, I do want to briefly share the screen here. You would pay the priest, you would pay the oracle a whole bunch of money in order to get a prophecy. Now, how did you get the prophecy? A priestess, and here's a painting of the priestess of Delphi. She's sitting on a golden tripod. It's kind of hard to see, and you have vapors coming up. She is probably stoned on eucalyptus leaves, because she would just babble completely incoherently. But then a priest would interpret those babblings for those who decided to pay for this. Whether it was a ruler, kings came to the oracle, or if they didn't themselves come, they would pay tribute so that they could get a prophecy and so on. Athens, in its better days, really before it decided to function as an empire, didn't listen to the Oracle of Delphi. And there was a singular period in the earlier part of the century where all the other city-states were told to surrender by the oracle to Persia, and they did. Athens was the only one which didn't listen to the oracle and stood and fought and prevailed. So I think you can probably figure out who the oracle was acting on behalf of. The other role, by the way, of the temple at Delphi was to function as a central bank. It's also where all the Greek city-states put their treasuries. Now, when you walked into the temple, one of the inscriptions was "Know thyself," which I'm sure many people have heard that, are familiar with that. Now, given the fact that you're going to an oracle who is interpreting incoherent babblings from a stoned priestess to tell you your future, it's fairly clear that know thyself really doesn't have anything to do with a search for actual truth or universal principles. Ultimately, it was used in any way that the sophists wanted, and frankly, for any purpose. Sophists, for those who might have missed the first class, was the prevailing form of so-called philosophy in Athens by the time of Socrates and Plato. Again, it's based on the idea that there are no principles, there are no universal truths. It's just a question of how well you can rhetorically manipulate somebody. The inscription at Delphi has much more to do with that than it does any actual search for the knowledge. Now, this actually sets the stage for the dialogue, which we're going to look at tonight, which is the Charmides dialogue. This is set just as Socrates returns, I think after about 2 years, from the first major battle of the Peloponnesian War. Peloponnesian War began in 432. And again, this is the outgrowth of Athens abandoning its war with the Persians and ending up in all sorts of battles with the other city-states, largely Sparta, with the Persians quite literally being the puppet masters behind the scenes. And so the Charmides dialogue has got, besides Socrates, has got 3 characters in it, 2 primary characters and one who's there just at the beginning, but actually plays a very significant role. The 2 primary characters are Charmides, who is a beautiful young boy, probably I would say 17 or 18 at the time, who is in a sense the subject, one of the subjects of the dialogue. He happens to be Plato's uncle. Now remember, Socrates is the major figure in this. Socrates was born, I believe, in 469. Plato was born in 424. So you're dealing with, between Socrates and Plato, obviously you're dealing with 2 generations here. So Socrates is looking at Charmides, who's probably maybe a little bit older than Plato, but nonetheless, given the family relations, he happens to be Plato's mother's brother. The other figure is Critias the fourth. He's also related. He's the older cousin of Charmides, who ends up becoming his guardian because Charmides' father dies. So these are the 2 major figures. These are relatives of Plato. And as you'll see, they play a critical role in the end point of this tragedy of Athens. Let me just highlight, again, to try and keep people located in history, let me just highlight 3 major dates to keep in mind. Number 1, 432, that's when the Peloponnesian War takes place. And again, this dialogue happens after the first battle. The second date I want you to remember, which we discussed extensively in the last class, is the period of 416, 415, 414. This is the ill-fated Sicilian expedition. This is essentially an imperial expedition that the Athenians take in the middle of the Peloponnesian War against Syracuse over in Sicily, which really is not directly involved in the war in one way or another. And it's a disaster, and it really is the beginning of the end for Athens. That played a critical role, we discussed last week, in the history of Alcibiades, who was the person who encouraged the Sicilian expedition and then ended up not being able to lead it because he was caught up in a scandal, which was a sacrilegious act, the profanation of these statues to the god Hermes. Now, the reason I revisit that particular date is one of the other people who was also accused of this sacrilege and was indicted is Charmides. So from where we are in this dialogue around 430 to a decade and a half later, Charmides too shares with Alcibiades, coming under this kind of indictment, which in all likelihood was a political operation undoubtedly run by the Persians, whoever the frontmen were, to just continue to sow complete confusion and chaos and terrible decisions on the part of the Athenians. The third major date I want you to remember is 404. That's the end of the Persian War. The end of the Peloponnesian War with the terrible defeat of Athens. And what happens is the Spartans put a group in power to rule on their behalf. The people that they put in to rule on their behalf over the defeated Athens are called the 30 tyrants, and they include Critias and Charmides. So again, like in the Alcibiades, you see the beginning of the process in 430 when the war begins, and you see the end of the process with the defeat of Athens, the failure and execution, assassination ultimately of Alcibiades, the tyranny of Critias and Charmides, and then their overthrow and execution. And remember, all of the people reading Plato's dialogues when he writes them at the time, this is their living memory. They've just lived through all of this. Now, the third person who plays just an introductory role in this dialogue is Chaerephon. He's of Socrates' generation. He's a longtime friend of Socrates. And again, Plato knows what he's doing dramatically. Chaerephon, it turns out at the very end of this process, ends up being part of the Democrats that overthrow Critias and Charmides' 30 tyrants. And whether he plays a role himself in their execution isn't clear, but he ends up with the Democrats. And of course, it's the Democrats who execute Socrates in 399. Chaerephon is already dead. But again, this bookends of the beginning, the middle, and the end of this historical unfolding tragedy is very vivid in terms of how Plato sets these. Now, again, let me just make clear, there are no good guys and there are no bad guys by this time. Everybody is being manipulated by the Persians with a big help from the Oracle of Delphi. And that's the other interesting thing about Chaerephon, this figure who just shows up at the very beginning. He's really very well known because Socrates quotes him when Socrates is defending himself before he's executed in the famous apology, Socrates' apology. He quotes his friend Chaerephon, making the point that Chaerephon had gone to the Oracle of Delphi in order to inquire of the Oracle what the Oracle thought about Socrates. And he comes back with a statement which seems to be positive, but obviously has many implications. But I think the importance is that Chaerephon is known as the person who went to the Oracle. And I think that is the backdrop, again, of this particular dialogue. You know, for those people who know Shakespeare, he quite often at the beginning of a play just drops something which is critical to the whole play. Like in Othello, in the very introduction, he makes the point that this Othello is a ruler on an island which is actually run by the Venetians, the ultimate manipulators. And of course, Othello is about how Othello is tragically manipulated, with the consequence that he kills his own wife and ultimately, with a completely tragic ending. But again, there's just this little droplet at the beginning, which locates really the entire thing. And I think Chaerephon actually plays that role in this in this dialogue, because really the question is how much of Greek society has completely abandoned any belief in the knowability of universal principles, or is committed in any way to the search for universal truth, but is instead going along with the opinion machine, which is being manipulated in the background by the Persians and by the oracle. So, these are deeply, deeply historical developments that are embedded in what is in reality a very short and somewhat simple Platonic dialogue. So what Tony and I are going to do at this point is similar to what we did last week. I'm going to kind of carry you along with a little bit of narrative in terms of what's going on in the dialogue. We're going to read a couple of sections of it to give you a sense of how Plato, through Socrates, is intent on showing to those who are reading or listening the seriousness of what happens when you are not rigorous in terms of a method for discovering and acting on actual truthful principles. So the dialogue begins with Socrates returning from battle, and he's immediately greeted by Chaerephon, his friend, who grabs him, wildly. But then very soon Critias appears, welcomes Socrates back, and they begin the dialogue, and Socrates asks of Critias, very important question, how is philosophy coming among the young men of Athens? And Critias says, well, you're going to have a chance to discover this for yourself, because here come a bunch of them, led by Charmides, and they go on to extol his beauty. And again, remember, we addressed this last week. There are some sections of Charmides which you might consider X-rated, because homosexuality was a common practice in Greek society. But when you look at Plato's dialogues, like Alcibiades, like Charmides, he always, even though he addresses some of these other attributes of these young men, he's constantly taking it someplace else, which I think you'll see as this, actually you'll see very quickly as this unfolds, because the first thing that Critias says is, well, you're going to have the opportunity to talk to Charmides, and by the way, I think you're going to be able to help him because he has a terrible headache. And I understand that you have a charm that you learned by which you might be able to cure his headache. So this is where Tony and I are going to start the reading. Tony, if you can pick it up on. Let me get Tony on the screen with me. So we're both up here. Okay.
Socrates has said that his headache cure has two parts to it, and that he was told about it by a Thracian, the barbarian. So Socrates says, this Thracian said that the Greeks were right in advising, as I told you just now. But Zalmoxis, our king, who is a god, said that as you ought not to attempt to cure eyes without head, or head without body, so you should not treat body without soul. And this was the reason why most maladies evaded the physicians of Greece, that they neglected the whole on which they ought to spend their pains. For if this were out of order, it was impossible for the part to be in order. For all that was good and evil, he said, in the body and in man altogether, was sprung from the soul, and flowed along from thence as it did from the head into the eyes. Wherefore that part was to be treated first and foremost, if all was to be well with the head and the rest of the body. And the treatment of the soul, so he said, my wonderful friend, is by means of certain charms. And these charms are words of the right sort. By the use of such words is soundness of mind engendered in our souls. and as soon as it is engendered and present, we may easily secure health to the head and to the rest of the body also. Now, in teaching me the remedy and the charms, he remarked, let nobody persuade you to treat his head with this remedy unless he has first submitted his soul for you to treat with the charm. For at present, he said, the cure of mankind is beset with the error of certain doctors who attempt to practice the one method without the other. And he most particularly enjoined on me not to let anyone, however wealthy or noble or handsome, induce me to disobey him. So I, since I've given him my oath and must obey him, will do as he bids. And if you agree to submit your soul first to the effect of the Thracian charms, according to the stranger's injunctions, I will apply the remedy to your head. Otherwise, we shall be at a loss what to do with you, my dear Charmides. Then Critias said,
the affection of the head, Socrates, will turn out to be a stroke of luck for the young man if he is compelled on account of his head to improve his understanding also. However, let me tell you, Charmides is considered to excel his comrades not only in appearance, but also in the very thing that you say is produced by your charm, soundness of mind. Temperance, you say it is, do you not?
Certainly.
Well, Charmides is considered by far and away the most temperate person now alive, while in every other aspect for a youth of his age, he is second to none. Now, let me just mention, you'll see Tony and I are going back and forth with the word temperance and soundness of mind. This is a Greek word, and really the best translation of it is soundness or wholeness of mind. Most translators kind of throw their hands up because there is not really one word which captures it in English. And they settled on the term temperance, which for most of us in the 20th century think about, maybe not drinking or something. So we are in general going to say wholeness of mind or soundness of mind, but there's times when that's too awkward. But I think you've got the idea in your head of what temperance actually is. And let me just say that what was embedded in this initial statement by Socrates, it really is like a prelude, which includes, it's like the opening theme of something, because he touches on, again, this question of the soul being more important than the body. And that was something, if you remember from the Alcibiades dialogue, was really where you got to the turning point of that dialogue as well, when you got out of the sense impressions and senses, and you began discussing something about the soul. So what happens at this point is Charmides agrees to engage in discussion with Socrates, and Socrates says, I can't give you this charm unless we can prove that you have soundness of mind. So do you have soundness of mind? And Charmides says, I'm really not sure. If I say that I do, I'm not, and I don't, I'll be an idiot. And if I say that I don't, so I really don't know. It's frankly a very honest response. So Socrates says, well, look, this is what our discussion is going to be about. And in the initial part of this dialogue, Charmides puts forward a couple of hypotheses in terms of what soundness of mind is. One is that it is being orderly and quiet. And Socrates pretty quickly shows that really doesn't work. And then he suggests, well, maybe it's modesty. And again, Socrates draws him into a dialogue, shows the contradictions of how he's thinking about it. And then he gets to the third. And he says, well, somebody once said to me that soundness of mind is attending to one's own business. And Socrates said, did that come from Critias? Critias says, no, that's not from me. So he draws out Charmides, again, on this question a little bit, and finally at a certain point, and begins to show all sorts of contradictions in the way that Charmides is arguing, at which point Critias actually can't restrain himself any longer. And he jumps in and says, well, actually, Tony, why don't you start with now Critias?
Yeah, now Critias for some time had been plainly burning with anxiety to distinguish himself in the eyes of Charmides and the company. There are other young men there too. And having with difficulty restrained himself heretofore, he now could do so no longer. For I believe that what I had supposed was perfectly true, that Charmides had heard this answer about temperance from Critias. And so Charmides, wishing to make him answer instead of himself, sought to stir him up in particular and pointed out that he himself had been refuted. But Critias rebelled against it and seemed to me to have got angry with him, as a poet does with an actor who mishandles his verses on the stage. And so he looked hard at him and said, you want to say this is Critias.
Do you really suppose, Charmides, that if you do not know what can have been the meaning of the man who said that soundness of mind was doing his own business, that that man did not know either?
Why, my excellent Critias, I said, no wonder if my friend at his age cannot understand. But you, I should think, may be expected to know in view of your years and your studies. So if you concede that soundness of mind is what he says, and you accept the statement, for my part, I would greatly prefer to have you as partner in the inquiry as to whether this saying is true or not.
Well, I quite concede it and accept it. So once again, so Critias has been drawn in to now be the main discussion partner with Socrates. And they go down various paths in terms of this inquiry about how doing one's own business is the equivalent, is what a definition of temperance is. And they get caught. I mean, Socrates, as he's very good at, catches up in all sorts of contradictions in terms of his initial hypotheses and discussions and so on. So then you reach the next point in the dialogue when they have been talking about various forms of knowledge and lack of knowledge and so on. And they get to a point where it makes it look like soundness of mind is, in essence, in an equivalent of ignorance. So Socrates.
Then it would seem that in doing what is helpful, he may sometimes do temperately and be temperate, but be ignorant of his own temperance?
But that, Socrates, could never be. If you think this in any way a necessary inference from my previous admissions, I would rather withdraw some of them and not be ashamed to say that my statements were wrong than concede at any time that a man who is ignorant of himself is of sound mind. For I would almost say that this very thing, self-knowledge, is soundness of mind. And I am at one with him who put up the inscription of those words at Delphi, namely, know thyself. For the purpose of that inscription on the temple is, as it seems to me, is to serve as the god's salutation as you enter it, instead of hail. This is a wrong form of greeting, and they should rather exhort one another with the words, be temperate. And thus the god addresses those who are entering his temple in a mode which differs from that of men. Such was the intention of the dedicator of the inscription in putting it up, I believe. And that he says to each man who enters in reality, be temperate. But he says it in a rather riddling fashion, as a prophet would, for know thyself and be temperate, or be of sound mind, are the same as the inscription. And I declare, though one is likely enough to think them different, an error into which I consider the dedicators of later inscriptions fell when they put up, these are other inscriptions, nothing overmuch and a pledge, and thereupon perdition. For they suppose that know thyself was a piece of advice, and not the God's salutation of those who were entering. And so, in order that their dedications too might equally have pieces of useful advice, they wrote these words and dedicated them. Now, my object in saying all this, Socrates, is to abandon to you all my previous argument. For though perhaps it was you who were more in the right, or perhaps it was I, yet nothing at all certain emerged from our statements, and to proceed instead to satisfy you of this truth, if you do not admit it, that soundness of mind is knowing oneself. So this sets up the latter part of the dialogue, which goes into, again, a lot of different pathways in terms of knowledge, or as is often translated, because the word that's used here is epistema, which is they translate as science, that which you stand upon. So it's looking at all different iterations of science, you know, the science of music, the science of cobblery, and comparing them and running into all sorts of roadblocks between that and this question of know thyself, which is the science of self. And they end up in another quandary about this question of knowing and not knowing. And they end up again with another one of these box canyons they've gotten into, so that you end up with an implication that again, there's a certain amount of ignorance involved in what they're actually looking at. And this is what sets up the final pages of the dialogue, which are a little bit more extensive. Tony and I are going to read all of them as it takes it to the very end of the dialogue. Right before we get to the final couple of lines, we're going to remind people of something when we get to the end. But this is where these quandaries have taken Critias and Socrates.
Yeah, Critias just said, in truth, your words are very strange. And Socrates answers, yes, by the dog, I said, and they strike me too in the same way. And it was in view of this just now that I spoke of strange results that I noticed, and said I feared we were not inquiring rightly. For in truth, let soundness of mind be ever so much what we say it is, I see nothing to show what good effect it has on us.
How so? Tell us in order that we on our side may know what you mean.
I expect I'm talking nonsense, but still one is bound to consider what occurs to one and not idly ignore it, if you have even a little concern for yourself.
And you are quite right.
Hear then my dream, whether it has come through horn or through ivory, meaning whether it's true or false. Suppose that soundness of mind were such as we now define her, and that she had entire control of us. Must it not mean that every act would be done according to the sciences, and no one professing to be a pilot when he was not would deceive us, nor would a doctor, nor a general, nor anyone else pretending to know something he did not know go undetected? And would not these conditions result in our having greater bodily health than we have now, safety in perils of the sea and war, and skillful workmanship in all our utensils or clothes, our shoes, nay, everything about us, and various things besides, because we should be employing genuine craftsmen? And if you liked, we might concede that prophecy, as the knowledge of what is to be, and soundness of mind directing her, will deter the charlatans and establish the true prophets as our prognosticators, our prophets. Thus equipped, the human race would indeed act and live according to knowledge. I grant you, for soundness of mind would not suffer ignorance to foist itself and take a hand in our labors, but that by acting according to knowledge, we should do well and be happy. This is a point which as yet we are unable to make out, my dear Critias.
But still, you will have some difficulty in finding any other fulfillment of welfare if you reject the rule of knowledge.
Then inform me further on one more little point. What is this knowledge? Do you mean of shoemaking?
Good heavens, no.
Well, of working in brass,
No,
in wool or wood or something else?
no, indeed.
Then we no longer hold to the statement that he who lives according to knowledge is happy. For these workers, though they live according to knowledge, are not acknowledged by you to be happy. You rather delimit the happy man, it seems to me, as one who lives according to knowledge about certain things. And I dare say you're referring to my instance of a moment ago, the man who knows all that is to come, the prophet. Do you refer to him or someone else?
Yes, I refer to him and someone else too.
Whom? Is it the sort of person who might know, besides what is to be, both everything that has been and now is, and might be ignorant of nothing? Let us suppose such a man exists. You're not going to tell me, I'm sure, of anyone who is alive, yet knowing more than he.
No, indeed.
And there is still one more thing I would fain know. Which of the sciences is that makes him happy? Or does he owe it to all of them alike?
By no means to all alike.
But to which sort most? One that gives him knowledge of what thing, present, past, or future? Is it that by which he knows draft playing?
Draft playing, no.
Reckoning?
By no means.
Health?
Well, health, more likely.
And that science to which I refer as the most likely gives him knowledge of what?
Of good and of evil.
Vile creature, you have all this time been dragging me round and round while concealing the fact that the life according to knowledge does not make us do well and be happy, not even if it be knowledge of all other knowledges together, but only it is of this single one concerning good and evil. For Critias, if you choose to take away this science from the whole number of them, will medicine any less give us health, or shoemaking give us shoes, or weaving clothes? Or will the pilot's art less prevent the loss of life at sea, or the generals in war?
Nonetheless.
But, my dear Critias, to have any of these things well and beneficially done will be out of our reach if that science is lacking.
That is true.
And that science, it seems, is not soundness of mind, but one whose business it is to benefit us. For it is not a science of sciences and lack of sciences, but of good and evil. So if this is beneficial, soundness of mind must be something else.
Well, I'm going to stop at this point and then move to the very end, because I think we're going to be going a little over time. And I think this makes the point that once again, as he did in Alcibiades, where suddenly the soul is introduced, as he prefaced at the very beginning, where he introduces the concept of good and evil, as opposed to these different categories, which Critias, which Charmides, and certainly which the sophists delight in, definitions, categories, contradictions. What is missing in all of this, and obviously what is completely lacking in Athenian society by the time it reaches its demise, is this recognition that there is a larger principle in all of these discussions, and it is the issue of what is the good. And it is which is not a simple question. The entirety of the Republic and the Timaeus are devoted to a rigorous scientific examination of how one might know the good, where the good might reside, essentially. And in all cases, it's not a thing, it's not a noun, it's not an answer at the end of the book. In all cases, it's a process of man's mind, which is a microcosm of the Creator, examining God's universe to discover the principles which are embedded in it. In a sense, these simple dialogues set at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War only open the door to you to the rigorous examination that has to be undertaken by citizens if they are going to have a successful society. Now, as we know, this is not done. As we know, Charmides and Critias come to a tragic end along with Athens and tens of thousands of other people. So we want to go to the very, very conclusion of this dialogue, which has, as the Alcibiades did last week, where Socrates says to Alcibiades, I fear what the democracy, what the people, what public opinion, I feel what the state and public opinion are going to do with you, despite your intentions. You know, it ends with that foreshadowing of the future, as does this, because as we know, Critias and Charmides end up being part of the 30 tyrants. So we're going to go to the end. And Tony, let's.
They're there.
Yeah.
They're there. What he says to Critias and Charmides, Socrates says, they're there. What are you two plotting to do?
Nothing. We have made our plot.
So you will use force before even allowing me to make my affidavit?
You must expect me to use force, since he, Critias, gives me the command. Take counsel, therefore, on your side as to what you will do.
But that leaves no room for counsel. For if once you set about doing anything and use force, no man alive will be able to withstand you.
Then do not you withstand me.
Then I will not withstand you.
And again, when you think beyond the overthrow of the 30 tyrants and the execution of these two people, they're replaced again by the Democrats. And it's the Democrats who put Socrates on trial and lead to his execution. You know, again, in these simple dialogues of Plato, you get this very, very rich encapsulation of an entire historical process. And I think this is absolutely critical for us today, because look, while there's many, many people, you know, who very properly say things like, will define things as evil, like human trafficking, or child mutilation, or other things which are obviously evil. It's not enough to just put the name evil on something. You have to understand a generative principle that what is evil is the rejection, or even worse, the crushing of that which is human. The power of the human mind to explore the universe, to act in the universe, which is very much the subject of the Republic and the Timaeus, and to improve the universe. One has to be engaged in that kind of deeper understanding of the principles of good and evil if citizens are going to make the kinds of decisions that we have to make in the very dangerous period ahead. And there is no better teacher in terms of how to do that than Plato. So I'll leave it with that and open it up to any discussion which people might want to have.